We continue with our discussion of the First Amendment. Now, the part of the First Amendment that we usually deal with is this section. Of course, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Well, those few words have to cover pretty much everything we do, from books to newspapers, magazines, websites, social media, broadcast, everything. How do we get to the idea that expression ought to be free? Well, there are competing philosophies, some which argue that people should be able to print, broadcast, or say whatever they want to, and then others that say, no, people are inherently bad, and they shouldn't be saying any of those terrible things. Philosophies for free expression include the marketplace of ideas, individual fulfillment, safety valve, self-governance, and of course, the old liberty versus license and bad tendency. We'll get into those in detail. The marketplace came to us first from John Milton, who wrote Areopagitica. Areopagitica was Milton's response to an act of the English Parliament creating the Royal Stationers' Company. The Royal Stationers' Company was a government-sanctioned monopoly on book printing. If you wanted to be a book printer in England, you had to be a member of the Royal Stationers. They had the market, and if anybody who wasn't a member tried to publish a book, they could use the power of the government to stop them. As such, it was profitable to go along with the government, and they did, knowing that if they printed books that the government didn't like, that the government could withdraw its monopoly and they'd be out of a job. Milton said in Areopagitica, who knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter? And his argument was that if the truth was faced with falsity, the truth would win out as long as there was a level playing field. His work in the marketplace was followed by John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher, who said that ideas are similar to goods in the marketplace. And he was a strong believer that expression ought to be free. Let's look at it this way. When you were growing up, when you got old enough to have solid foods or different kind of foods, your families introduced you to soup. In many cases, it was Campbell's. Campbell's is our ordinary, run-of-the-mill, generally accepted idea of soup. It may be the best idea of soup. It may be soup as truth. But as you grew older and families became a little more adventurous, they might have added Progresso, a second idea of soup. And people would choose, do I think this is the truth about soup, or do I think that is the truth about soup? The comparison leads us to the truth. And then it might be that you tried a generic brand of soup. Maybe that is the correct idea of what soup should be. You might have dealt with a regional sort of soup. This is, I forget what part of the country I got this from. More extreme ideas until we finally wind up with turtle soup made with real turtles. If you look at those 6 cans, if you taste them, and I wouldn't recommend it because I got these cans back when I first started teaching media law in the previous century, and I think they are long past their due date. But if you looked at them, if you tasted them, the comparison would tell you which one was your soup, the truth of soup. And that's what the marketplace of ideas is all about. Let these goods be in the marketplace, let people do comparison shopping, and they will come up with the truth. We also see a reference to a marketplace of ideas in Justice Holmes' opinion, a dissent actually, in the case of Abrams versus United States. Abrams dealt with the Espionage Act of 1918. A provision of the act made it a crime to try to obstruct the war effort. Mr. Abrams, an immigrant from Russia, and some of his friends got together and printed leaflets, and they distributed those outside of an arms factory. The leaflets called for the workers to stop making bullets and bombs because some of those bullets and bombs would be used against Russian workers. The context is this. 1917, Russia and the Allies are fighting Germany. There is a revolution. The communists rise up. They overthrow the Tsar. And Russia is plunged into civil war. The Reds, the communists, are fighting the White Russians. White Russians are those who supported the old regime. Western nations, those fighting Germany, supported the White Russians, and the United States sent both arms as well as military forces to Russia. Mr. Abrams told the workers in his flyer that they should stop making these bullets because they would be hurting other workers in Russia, now the Soviet Union. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. His conviction was appealed. It got to the Supreme Court. The majority of the Supreme Court said, well, you violated the law. We are going to uphold your conviction. Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis dissented. Justice Holmes said Mr. Abrams was engaged in speech. His speech was not going to be effective. He would not make the United States lose the war. And he said, why shouldn't we allow people like Mr. Abrams to say what they think? In this quote from Justice Holmes, he argued that more voices would allow people to find the truth. Coerced silence, laws to prevent expression, work only if you think that expression doesn't mean anything. If words cannot convince people to pursue a different course, then you can eliminate words, you can control words. But if you realize that words can change the course of nations, then you should protect expression, because those words compete with others. Eventually people will decide what they think is the correct thing to do. But it can only happen if the marketplace is open to new ideas. In an appellate court case, Associated Press versus United States, Judge Learned Hand said, we're more likely to get to the truth. We're more likely to find the correct answer when we have a lot of people speaking rather than having the government decide what people should hear. In Reno versus ACLU, a case that struck down the Communications Decency Act, an act that would have regulated the content of the internet, Justice Stevens, writing for the court, said the internet was a marketplace of ideas. And in a different internet case involving COPA, the Child Online Protection Act, a federal judge in Pennsylvania held the act unconstitutional, explaining that even when we allow unconventional speech in the marketplace, we will be more likely to find the truth. So the marketplace is based upon that idea. Don't control expression, because if you stifle expression, you're stifling the marketplace. You're keeping goods and ideas out of the marketplace, and you're denying people the opportunity to find the truth. How fun would it be if the only soup you could find was Campbell's chicken noodle? Our second philosophy for freedom of expression is that of individual fulfillment, advanced by Professor Emerson. Emerson said that the purpose of a human being is to realize his or her own character and potential. The government, therefore, should not restrict expression, because being able to read and hear and see all sorts of ideas will help you decide who you are. Now, Professor Emerson made a distinction between expression and conduct. So as you can see in the textbook, you can protest the war, and that should be protected. But if you blow up an ROTC building or an arms factory, well, that action should be able to be punished. Professor Baker advanced the idea, and he said, part of being who you are is defining yourself. Defining yourself means that you have to have the ability to express yourself. A good example, you're walking around, you'll see people who are wearing buttons, either for Donald Trump or against him, for Hillary Clinton or against her. If you wear a button that is pro-Trump, it's not going to mean that Hillary Clinton is going to drop out of the presidential race because you wear that campaign button. It's not going to affect the election. But what you're doing is you're declaring to the world that you support Donald Trump. It is achieving your own character. Our third philosophy is safety valve. Safety valve is based upon the idea that if we allow free expression, we don't restrict it, then people will get things out of their system. For example, we have elections on a regular basis. Somebody wins, somebody loses. The person who supports the losing candidate will complain. Will say the election was rigged, I hate the person who won, but that's it. This doesn't happen everywhere in the world. In some places in the history of the world, the winning candidate might be assassinated, or candidates in a political race might be subject to violence. We have peaceful transfers of power. It doesn't happen everywhere, and it's one of the rationales for the safety valve. Justice Louis Brandeis referred to the idea of allowing speech in the case of Whitney versus California. Ms. Whitney was from a prominent family. She was the niece of an American president. She was prosecuted and convicted for helping to restart a chapter of the Communist Party in California. It was against the law to do that back around the turn of the last century. Although Miss Whitney's conviction was upheld, and although Justice Brandeis concurred in upholding her conviction, he pointed out the problems of restricting speech. If you repress speech, it creates hate, and hate menaces stable government. Our fourth philosophy is self-governance. Professor Meiklejohn argued that speech on public issues have to be protected. Now, if it's not on public issues, then it gets less protection. The Supreme Court has most often adopted self-governance as a philosophy for protecting expression. In fact, we see that even today. Political speech is protected. Commercial speech, that is to say, speech where you're selling stuff other than candidates, has First Amendment protection, but it is not as strong as that of political speech. So Bush the candidate, speech about Bush the candidate must be completely free. Speech about Bush beans, well, there can be regulation, and the Federal Trade Commission does that. 4 philosophies as to why we should protect speech. It's an interesting thing. When we talk about the philosophies, we're talking about philosophical arguments to make. Philosophical arguments are not used in the application of the law. For example, let's say you're taking the test, and in the first test, one of the topics we'll be covering is obscenity. You'll learn that if speech meets a particular definition, it is considered obscene and constitutionally can be punished because it does not enjoy the protection of the First Amendment. If you get an obscenity question, that is not the time to say, well, under individual fulfillment, the person who is looking at these dirty pictures ought to be able to do so in order to realize his or her full potential. Don't get into philosophy. The section on philosophy is to help you to understand why it is so important for us to advocate for free expression. Because there are a lot of voices out there who don't want particular ideas or speakers to be heard. Which moves us into philosophies opposed to free expression. The first is liberty versus license. The second, bad tendency. Liberty versus license was most well articulated in the case of State versus Guilford. In State versus Guilford, which we will also see as Neer versus Minnesota, Howard Guilford and Jane Neer published a newspaper in Minnesota. It was a scandal sheet. They alleged that members of city government were mobbed up, that the police were corrupt, and there was a Minnesota state law that said if you were a scandal sheet, a judge could issue a prior restraint to keep you from publishing your scandal sheet. And the only time you would be allowed to publish again is if you promised to be respectful and nice. Howard Neer appealed this prior restraint to the Minnesota Supreme Court. The Minnesota Supreme Court upheld the prior restraint, saying that we protect speech when the people who are speaking or publishing are doing so with good motives and justifiable ends. and went further to say the Constitution, that is to say the Minnesota Constitution, never intended to protect publications devoted to scandal and defamation. When the case reached the United States Supreme Court, the result was the opposite. But liberty versus license, it's hard to think of a protection for speech that relies upon the speaker always being nice. The First Amendment and free expression stands for the proposition that any idea ought to be protected in the marketplace, and that if you're only going to protect speech that you like, well, there are no protections. Our second philosophy against free expression is based upon something called bad tendency. Bad tendency is based upon a view that people are inherently weak and easily led into sin. And bad tendency is based on the idea that if you say a particular idea, then people will be prompted by that to do a bad thing. Condom. One of the reasons that we don't allow people to talk about condoms in high school is, under bad tendency, if you say the word condom in a high school, the students will stop what they're doing and start having sex. It's an exaggeration. But in discussions about sex education or health classes where they talk about preventing pregnancy or the spread of sexually transmitted illnesses, people object to using the word condom, even though condoms are remarkably effective when used properly at preventing both pregnancy and sexually transmitted illnesses. People will say, you'll tell them about condoms, that will make them want to go out and have sex. The Bush administration, Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, at the time that awareness of AIDS was becoming more widespread, had a problem. They put on a large-scale campaign to warn people about the spread of AIDS and HIV, telling them to avoid conduct or behaviors that would expose them to the risk of getting those two. But only a handful of their public service announcements mentioned condoms, even though condoms were the most effective way to prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS in sexually active people. And that was because people objected. If condoms were spoken about, generally a lot of folks would start having sex. More recently, in the Menifee Union School District down in the Inland Empire in Southern California, a parent found out from her student that the dictionary in his middle school class contained oral sex. Now, the parent complained to the district. The district responded. It pulled the dictionary from the shelves and put together a committee to decide if the dictionary should be banned permanently from the middle schools because of the, quote, sexually graphic entry. The removal of the dictionary was covered in the local media, specifically the Riverside Press Enterprise. The solution was the dictionary was returned to the classroom along with a second sanitized version of a dictionary, and parents would have to sign a piece of paper telling the school which dictionary their child would be able to read, the one that had oral sex or the one that didn't have oral sex. Incidentally, the dictionary entry for oral sex was here, oral stimulation of the genitals. But under bad tendency, the fact that middle schoolers would know what oral sex was meant that they would be having oral sex. That's bad tendency. For those in favor of restricting speech, a key tool is prosecution, being able to put somebody in jail or to fine someone for particular kinds of expression. The question now is, when can speech be punished constitutionally? Here in your readings, you come to the clear and present danger test. It comes to us from the Supreme Court case of Schenck versus United States. It is another prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1918. A section of that act made it a crime to hinder recruitment. The United States instituted a draft, the first since the Civil War, and it was calling up young men to enter the service to go fight Germany and its allies. Mr. Schenck said, "This clearly is not constitutional. This is involuntary servitude. The government is calling you up. It's telling you to go into the army. It's putting you in harm's way, and you don't have a choice in the matter." So Mr. Schenck and some of his friends printed up pamphlets and handed them out, advising young men to avoid the draft, telling them to not respond to the draft notice, not to participate in this new form of involuntary servitude. Well, Mr. Schenck and his friends were arrested and convicted. Schenck appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld his conviction. Justice Holmes said, "To determine the constitutionality of punishing expression, we need to look at the expression itself and the circumstances of the expression. When we combine the two, if they create a clear and present danger that they will bring about an evil that Congress has the right to prevent, then both the law and the punishment are constitutional." Here, we're looking at clear. Is the bad thing real? If Mr. Schenck succeeds in his campaign to get young men to stop showing up for the draft, then we don't have an army. And not having an army is a bad thing, especially at a time of war. Here's the thing you've probably heard in popular culture. Justice Holmes says that if you falsely yell fire in a crowded theater, it's likely to result in death and injury. Falsely yelling fire. If there's a fire, you might not want to yell it, but you should let people know that the place is going up. The second part of the test is present. Is the bad thing that the words will cause to happen now or in the immediate future? Going back to Justice Holmes and falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater, you yell fire in a theater when there's no fire, the crowd is going to panic then and there, and the risk of death and injury will occur within seconds. When you put the two together, Mr. Schenck's punishment is constitutional because his expression did constitute a clear and present danger. Here's the key. Clear and present danger is a test of the constitutionality of the punishment of speech. Clear and present danger is not a law. It's not a statute. Therefore, you should not write on an answer, "She was guilty of violating clear and present danger." You cannot violate a test. You can pass a test, you can fail a test, but you can't violate it. Instead, you would write, "She's shouting fire on a gambling riverboat. There was no fire, people were injured." So under the clear and present danger test, we see that her speech constitutionally can be punished because of the real harm and the immediacy of the harm demonstrated by what happened when she shouted fire falsely on the riverboat. Think it through. It'll make sense. We'll continue in the next lecture.